Hitler actually broke no German law with what he did. And it's very true. It's a very good point. All the highlights, the dehumanization of Jews, the concentration camps, there was no German law that was violated. There was no appeal to their own nation that the people could go off of. In fact, many of the actions they did to speak out against the Nazis were illegal. And I think it obviously calls into question the law, that the law must be just, it must be right, and it must be true. And so we certainly saw that with slavery, and we see that with the overturning of Roe and Dobbs, and there's still a lot of dehumanization going on in our country. Dobbs did most of the job, but not the whole job. It could have been better, but it certainly gives us an opportunity to point to our dark history of slavery and say, we've done it again, and we're correcting it again.
And what you've said, Sean, I think really proves the existence of a universal natural moral law because, as you said, it didn't break German law. There's no constitution or charter or foundational documents that the right to not be exterminated in a camp comes from. There's something that we all recognize that the Holocaust was wrong. We all recognize that slavery was wrong. And I think sometime in the hopefully not too distant future, everybody will have clear enough eyes and a clear enough mind to recognize that we all know that abortion is wrong. It doesn't, our rights don't come from the government. They don't come from a document. Our rights come from God Almighty. And I think everything you just said really proves that point that we've been trying to make as pro-lifers for so many years, that we know we don't need to justify life. It's a universally held value.
Yeah, and I think it'll be a struggle, but a good struggle, and one worth it. That'll be a long time. People forget Reconstruction after the Civil War was mayhem. I mean, even General Robert E. Lee wanted to help with it and helped sort of make the peace, and he was, of course, the leader of the Confederacy. But he knew once they lost that there was no room. There was a lot of ground to make up. And there was no room for just constant division. So he worked with Lincoln for that, committed to it anyways. And uh, we're going to have that. Reconstruction was ugly. We had segregation. I mean, for all the actual racial problems our country has had, which we don't talk about anymore. Now we just say everyone's a racist. So it's just, okay, now we all move on. But or we say nothing has changed, which is absurd and a complete insult to the history of Black people in our country who suffered greatly.
When 10
But
years ago we had a Black president, I think people forget that sometimes when they say nothing has changed.
64% of white people voted for.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's all that's absurd. That the NFL draft is no different than the slave trade. There was some nut on ESPN that said that, and you think about if my great grandfather was an actual slave, I'd be like, you don't know what you're talking about. That is a joke. It's an honor to be drafted into the NFL. It's awesome. It's the dream of a lot of kids of a lot of different colors, by the way. To say that it's no different than the slave trade is just absolutely disconnected with reality and wokeness. But anyways, my point is that it's a long process to healing, to dragging people out of the dark ages. And we're going to have to do that. We are going to have to do that. And it's going to take a very, very long time. And we'll get into that during this podcast. But we're basically going to go over whether being authentically pro-life means canceling abortion supporters. Like, can't we just dive in? Can't we take a page out of the wokeness and be like, what are you talking about? We have killed 64 million of our own citizens. Burn it down, baby. Tear it down. Rip down the statues. Rip down the Supreme Court building. Tear down the Capitol. All this stuff. Why can't we do that? Why can't we go rip down statues of people and say, shame on you. You had an abortion. You did an abortion. You supported abortion. And we'll get into some of the specifics of that. So let's start with that first question, Steve, because I remember when 2020 was going on, I was very proud of the pro-life movement at large, certainly proud of 40 Days for Life volunteers. We're peaceful. We're prayerful. we're law abiding, even when we're persecuted by law enforcement, which now is at an all time high. We obey the law. We have to sue people, but we obey it and we're peaceful and we don't riot. But isn't there an argument, Steve, to say that's ridiculous? That just shows your weakness. You know,
Yeah,
they're murdering children, and you're just sitting there following these unjust laws.
yeah, they sort of try to suggest they were hypocrites, right? We've done podcasts on the topic of abortion being not just genocide, but the largest, grandest scale genocide there's ever been before. And people are saying, if you really believe that, you know, how are you living side by side? How are you neighbors with people who support abortion when you think they're a genocidal maniac or something to that effect? And so I think there's an argument to be made for that, but it's not the right argument because, first of all, if we're going to talk about justice, there's no justice in vigilante justice. There's no world in which you see just sort of renegades out policing in lieu of the actual law enforcement. There are channels and there are structures that we can work through for reform. And when we go to vigilanteism, it turns into sort of this every man for himself, and you get the ultimate moral relativism where might makes right, and whoever has more power, more force, more guns is the victor. That's a very dangerous place. It's kind of like when you're having like a behavioral issue with a 3-year-old and you say things like use your words. That's the pro-life movement is the side of this debate that is using its words